Perhaps you arrived here with a tired mind, too much information, too much noise, too many thoughts pressing over one another even as night has already fallen. The modern world leaves us very little silence, and sometimes what exhausts us most is not the work itself, but the feeling that we must understand, must keep up, must grasp everything at once. But tonight you don't need to do that. This video was not created to explain the universe. It was created to soften your mind with a very gentle question: if the reality you are living in is not all there is that truly frightening? Or perhaps it simply reminds us that we are not meant to carry the entire weight of existence on our own. When scientists speak of the possibility that another reality may have quietly intersected with our world, try to hear it not as a shocking discovery, but as a whisper that everything might be larger than the worries you are holding. As Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The universe is change, our life is what our thoughts make it." So allow yourself to slow down. There is no need to remember, no need to understand everything. Just listen and let the questions drift past you, light as a breath, as sleep begins to find its way to you. Before any question was ever asked, before even the desire to understand the universe was already there, silent, undemanding, offering no explanations. Tonight is the same. You do not need to keep up with anything. There is no need to remember names, no need to hold on to concepts, no need to force your mind to stay alert. The science of this night does not come to prove, but to soothe, much like the night sky itself, which does not try to say anything, yet still slows every thought. We have grown used to living in a world that constantly urges us forward, to understand faster, to know more, to go farther. Even when we lie down, the mind keeps running as if stopping for a moment might mean missing something important. But perhaps the most important thing of all is being allowed not to understand just for a while. The philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote in Meditations, "Be like the cliff against which the waves continually break, but it stands firm and tames the fury of the water around it." To stand firm is not to resist the waves, but to no longer react to every surge that comes. The universe is the same. It is not in a hurry. It does not ask us to match its rhythm. When modern science speaks of things beyond intuition, overlapping realities, possibilities never yet seen, we often feel unsettled, as if the familiar ground beneath us is beginning to tremble. Yet within that trembling lies a deep comfort. This world does not depend on whether you understand it or not. Albert Einstein once wrote, "The most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious." Not every mystery needs to be unraveled. Some exist simply to remind us that human consciousness is not the center of everything. And in no longer being the center, there is a rare lightness. Carl Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." Tonight, to awaken does not mean becoming more lucid or sharp, but turning inward to a place where questions do not need answers, where presence alone is enough. So let the concepts drift past you like clouds. Do not hold them. Do not analyze. Do not argue. Just listen to this slow, steady rhythm of narration as you would listen to the wind passing a window at midnight. The universe does not need you to understand it in order to continue existing. And you do not need to understand everything to be allowed to rest. Right here in this moment, as you breathe, as you listen, as you let go, everything is already calm enough for sleep to arrive naturally and very gently. After the silence of the previous chapter has had time to spread, when your breathing has begun to slow and the mind no longer needs to cling to any concept, a very old question gently appears. It is not loud. It does not demand an immediate answer. It simply rests there like a distant star still shining, even after you have grown accustomed to the dark. Humanity has carried this question for a very long time, longer than science, longer even than language itself. From the moment humans first looked up at the night sky and wondered who they were within that vast emptiness, one thought has arisen again and again across civilizations. Is this reality all there is? Or is it only one very particular version, a way in which the universe allows itself to be experienced? This question does not come from ambition. It comes from fragility, from the moment we realize that what we see, what we touch, what we remember, may not be as complete as we once believed. Plato spoke of this more than 2,000 years ago in the Republic, through the famous image of the cave people chained in place, seeing only shadows cast upon a wall, and believing those shadows to be the entirety of the world. Though Plato did not use the phrase multiple realities, he planted a deep seed that what we call real may be only one layer of something far greater. Centuries later, René Descartes could not rest easily with this question either. In Meditations on First Philosophy, he wrote, "I will suppose, therefore, that not God who is supremely good and the source of truth, but rather some malicious demon of the utmost power and cunning has employed all his energies in deceiving me." Descartes did not truly believe in such a demon, but he understood something essential. If we cannot be certain of the foundations of reality, then everything we take for granted must be placed at least temporarily within the parentheses of doubt. Then came Immanuel Kant, who made the question gentler yet deeper still. Kant argued that we never access the thing in itself reality as it truly is. We only encounter phenomena reality as it appears through the structure of the human mind. Space, time, causality. These may not be properties of the universe itself, but ways in which consciousness organizes experience. In other words, the reality you are living in may be a version that has been translated to fit your capacity to perceive. This idea is not meant to unsettle you. On the contrary, it carries a quiet and unusual comfort. For if reality is not all there is, then the worries you are carrying are not the whole story either. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote in Beyond Good and Evil, "There are no facts, only interpretations." This line is often misunderstood as a denial of truth, but at a deeper level, it is a reminder that human beings always live within their interpretations of the world. And those interpretations can change, can soften, can be set down, at least for tonight. As you lie here listening, you may still carry unanswered questions about your life, about past choices, about things that have not yet had time to happen. They appear as evidence that this reality has never fit perfectly. Fyodor Dostoevsky understood this well. In The Brothers Karamazov, he lets Ivan say, "I accept God, but I refuse the world he has created." This is not meaningless rebellion. It is the pain of a human being who feels that this reality, with its suffering, injustice, and loss, cannot be the whole of meaning. And yet, Dostoevsky also shows that this question does not need to be solved by reason. It is endured. It is carried. It is left alone like a crack through which light can enter. Carl Jung, from the perspective of depth psychology, turned this question inward. He wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." If reality has many layers, then the first one you can touch is not the universe out there, but the world within you. Images, memories, symbols, dreams that return without clear reason. Jung believed that the human mind does not merely reflect reality, but participates in shaping it. And in that process, we live inside a version of the world woven from memory, emotion, and the unconscious. This does not mean that everything is an illusion. It only means that you do not need to carry the entire universe on your shoulders in order to be allowed to exist. And when modern science begins to whisper about other possibilities of reality, parallel versions, overlapping layers of existence, perhaps what matters most is not whether they are true or not, but the deeply human feeling that arises when we realize this reality is not sealed shut. It has openings, it has depth, it has room to breathe. As William James once wrote, "Our normal waking consciousness, rational consciousness as we call it, is but one special type of consciousness, whilst all about it parted from it by the filmiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. Perhaps the reality you are living in is only one mode of waking among many possibilities, and that does not make it less meaningful. It only makes it less lonely." When you allow this question to exist without demanding an answer, the mind begins to loosen. It no longer has to strain to grasp meaning, no longer has to force itself to keep up with the world. You only need to be here, in this version, in this moment. And precisely when you stop trying to decide whether this reality is all there is, sleep begins to slip in, like a very ancient trust that the universe, whether one or many, is still wide enough to let you rest. After the question from the previous chapter has been gently set down, not resting anymore as a concern demanding an answer, but like a small pebble sinking quietly beneath the surface of the water, we can slow our steps even further. Not to descend into abstraction, but to look at something very familiar: light. Light has always been there, in the room where you are lying, in the screen you have already turned off, in your half-closed eyelids where darkness is never completely dark. And yet science has discovered that light is not as simple as we once believed. Quantum mechanics, one of the strangest and most tender branches of modern science, tells us that light does not decide what it is until someone looks at it. It sounds more like a metaphor than a law. And yet this is what experiments have been quietly whispering for more than a century. In the quantum world, light is both a wave and a particle, not a wave at one moment and a particle at another, but both at once existing together in a suspended, undecided state. Only when there is observation, when there is a measurement, when there is a look, does light decide how it will appear. The physicist Werner Heisenberg once wrote in Physics and Philosophy, "What we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. The sentence is not loud, but if you listen to it long enough, it can slow down the very idea of objective reality. Perhaps the world is not simply out there waiting for us to record it. Perhaps the world is always in an open state, and the way we look is part of the story." This thought is not meant to grant humans ultimate power. It does not claim that consciousness creates the universe in a simple sense. But it gestures toward a very subtle truth: the observer does not stand outside reality, and that if we allow ourselves to feel, it is not frightening at all. It is deeply human. Albert Einstein famously expressed his unease with this idea when he asked, "Do you really believe the moon exists only when you look at it?" Einstein did not reject quantum mechanics. He was simply unsettled by its implications. For if light particles and waves need an observer to take shape, then the boundary between the outer world and inner experience is no longer as sharp as we once believed. But tonight, we do not need to take sides in that debate. We do not need to resolve the tensions of physics. We only need to listen to the feeling it leaves behind that there are things in the universe that are not in a hurry to become something definite. They are allowed to wait, like you, like the thoughts drifting through your mind right now. They do not need to decide immediately whether they are worry, memory, or meaning. They can simply be there, unformed, unnamed. Niels Bohr, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, once said, "Anyone who is not shocked by quantum theory has not understood it." And yet, perhaps after the initial shock, what remains is not confusion, but a very strange softening. For if light does not need to decide until it is observed, then perhaps your life does not need to be fully understood in order to still have value. Carl Jung, approaching from a very different path, touched something similar when he wrote in The Undiscovered Self. The unconscious is not just evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good. There are parts of us like quantum light that have not yet chosen a state, not yet wounded, not yet healed, not yet a finished story. They are simply potential. And trying to look at them too soon, naming them too quickly, analyzing them too urgently, can sometimes be what causes them to collapse into a fixed shape. Quantum mechanics does not teach us how to live, but it allows us to rest within uncertainty. At night, when the light softens, when objects lose their sharp outlines, the world comes closer to its quantum nature. Not clear, not decided, not forced. And in that space, your consciousness is also allowed to step back. You do not need to observe every thought. You do not need to monitor every emotion. You can simply let them exist like light before it is measured. As Ludwig Wittgenstein once wrote in Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, "Whereof one cannot speak thereof, one must be silent. That silence is not an absence. It is a space where all possibilities remain open." And perhaps that is what quantum mechanics and philosophy as well have been whispering to humanity all along. You do not need to decide who you are in this moment. You do not need to define the world before being allowed to rest within it. Light is still there whether you look at it or not. Reality continues whether you understand it or not. And within that very gentle suspension, where there is no harsh observation, no demand for conclusions, sleep can arrive not as a shutting down, but as another state of consciousness. Soft, open, and not yet required to be anything at all. When the light of the previous chapter has softened, when the thought that the world does not need to decide immediately has had time to settle, another door opens, not loudly, not dramatically, but as a very gentle shift in how we imagine reality. For centuries, humans believed that when one thing happens, all other possibilities vanish. One choice is chosen and every other choice is erased. But quantum mechanics, in one of its quietest corners, proposes something different. An idea that does not say reality collapses, but that it branches. The many worlds. Interpretation, proposed by Hugh Everett in 1957, does not describe the universe as a stage where only one script is allowed to play out. It suggests that every time there is a possibility, every time there is a choice, reality does not select one and discard the rest. Instead, each possibility continues to exist in another branch. Nothing is eliminated. No path truly disappears. They simply continue elsewhere. This idea often frightens people because it is too vast, too abundant, too far beyond familiar intuition. But if you listen to it at night with a mind that has lowered its defenses, it carries a strangely gentle comfort. that the universe is not harsh. It does not force everything into win or lose, right or wrong all at once. It allows abundance. It allows parallelism. It allows what might have happened to keep existing without crowding your life. William James once wrote, "In a pluralistic universe, the world is not one block but many interwoven strands." The many worlds. Interpretation in a very quiet way makes that sentence more concrete than ever. If every possibility is lived somewhere, then the choice you made tonight, what you did not do, no longer carries the burden of having to be the single correct choice of the entire universe. It only needs to be your choice in this branch. There is a familiar sadness many people carry when night falls. The roads not taken, the words not spoken, the versions of ourselves imagined in moments of deep quiet. The many worlds. Interpretation does not promise that you will meet those versions again. It does not say you can step into another branch, but it whispers something else entirely. Those possibilities are not erased from the fabric of existence. Fyodor Dostoevsky once wrote in Notes from Underground, "I say let the world go to hell, but I should always have my tea." Beneath the irony lies a deeply human pain, the feeling of being forced to live inside a single reality, a straight line with no turns. But if reality is truly a tree with countless branches, then being on this branch is not a failure of the others. Carl Jung, speaking of the people we might have become, wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." In the light of the many worlds. Interpretation, this line can be heard in a new way. You do not need to become all of your possibilities to be whole. The other versions, if they exist, are living their own lives with joys and sorrows you do not need to carry. And you, the version lying here listening to this slow voice, only need to be present for this branch. No more, no less. Many people fear that the many worlds interpretation makes life meaningless. If everything happens somewhere, then why care? But perhaps it does the opposite. It takes away the illusion that you must represent the entire universe with every decision. And it gives back to you the relief of a finite life, no longer threatened by the fear of having missed everything. As Hannah Arendt once wrote, "Each new birth guarantees this world a new beginning." Every moment you live is still a beginning, even if other beginnings are unfolding elsewhere. At night, when the mind no longer needs to optimize a life, the idea of parallel branches can be felt not as something to understand, but as a very gentle widening, that the world is not so severe as to allow only one path. That existence is wide enough to hold both what happened and what did not. And because of that, you do not need to cling tightly to the past, nor worry excessively about the future. This branch, this moment, is already enough to let you rest. When reality does not collapse but branches, it does not ask you to track every path. It simply invites you to remain where you are. And in that small permission, the body begins to loosen. The mind stops straining to prove meaning. Sleep arrives not as an escape, but as a way for this branch to continue very gently. When the thought of branching realities has had time to settle, when the feeling that no choice is ever truly erased has begun to soothe the mind, another question appears, lighter, closer, and perfectly suited to the night. If there are many such worlds, where are they? We often imagine parallel worlds as distant places pushed to the far edges of imagination, lying at distances no vessel could ever reach. Yet many modern theories suggest a different image, quieter and far more intimate. Those worlds do not overlap. They do not collide. They do not intrude. But neither are they truly far. They exist alongside one another like different dreams within the same night of sleep. When you dream, you can pass through many scenes, many stories, many versions of yourself. Those dreams do not press against one another. They do not compete for space. They simply exist in parallel, each with its own rhythm, its own logic, its own emotional tone. And when you wake, no dream is more correct than another. They are simply different experiences consciousness has passed through. William James once wrote in The Varieties of Religious Experience, "Our normal waking consciousness is but one special type of consciousness. Whilst all about it parted from it by the filmiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different." That sentence is not only about religion or mysticism. It speaks to the possibility that other forms of existence may be very near separated from us by only a thin veil. In physics, this idea appears when scientists realize that parallel worlds, if they exist, do not need to share space in the way we are used to imagining. They may exist within the same larger structure while each world preserves its own order. No pushing, no crowding, no conflict. Heard at night, this thought has a curious effect. It softens the sense that this world is too cramped, that everything is crowding inside your mind, that past, present, and future are colliding with no escape. But if realities can exist in parallel without colliding, then perhaps the different parts of you can as well. The thoughts you once had, but did not pursue. The emotions you were not ready to face. The versions of you that live in memory. They do not need to cancel one another for you to be allowed to be yourself. Carl Jung once wrote in Psychological Types, "The psyche is a self-regulating system that maintains its equilibrium just as the body does." The mind, like the universe, does not need to force everything into a single point. It knows how to let different parts exist side by side without breaking the whole. In many Eastern philosophical traditions, this idea appeared very early. Reality was not seen as a rigid block, but as a flow of states. No state needs to annihilate another. They alternate layer softly without conflict. Lao Tzu wrote in the Tao Te Ching, "Reality is not what it seems," not as a warning, but as an invitation to loosen one's grip. When parallel worlds are imagined as neighboring dreams, this reality no longer feels like a prison. It becomes a quiet room in a very large house where many other rooms also have their own lights on. You do not need to enter them all. You do not need to shut them away. You only need to stay in your own room and allow the others to exist. Fyodor Dostoevsky once wrote in The Idiot, "The soul is healed by being with children." Perhaps what he meant was not only innocence, but the ability to be fully present in a moment without being haunted by parallel possibilities. Children do not worry that a more exciting game might be happening somewhere else. They simply play the game in front of them. In that light, the idea of parallel worlds no longer feels overwhelming. It becomes a very gentle lesson. You do not need to be everywhere to be whole. You only need to be here. As the night deepens, as sounds fade, the mind begins to resemble a lake with no ripples. Other worlds, if they exist, continue on very near, yet not touching. And that does not require you to be alert. It does not ask you to understand. It does not demand that you stay awake. When the idea of parallel worlds has grown more familiar, not as a distant abstraction, but as quiet dreams existing side by side, a more subtle possibility begins to reveal itself. Not that those worlds are completely separate, but that they may touch ever so lightly. Not a collision, not an intrusion, just a contact so gentle that it cannot be seen, yet gentle enough to leave a trace. In modern physics, some scientists have dared to ask such questions. If other realities exist, are they truly silent toward one another? Or might it be that at the deepest layers of nature they exchange with one another through signals so faint that they appear only as irregularities, particles drifting off course, without clear reason, fluctuations that do not quite fit the model's phenomena that repeat, yet cannot be precisely reproduced? Not enough to confirm, only enough to suspect. And it is precisely within this ambiguity that science and philosophy begin to speak with a shared voice, very slowly, very softly. David Bohm, the physicist and philosopher, once wrote, "In wholeness and the implicate order, reality may be fundamentally undivided." If reality is not absolutely partitioned, then the idea of worlds touching one another is not irrational. It is simply a reminder that boundaries may be softer than we imagine. Such interactions, if they exist, would not resemble communication between human beings. There would be no clear message, no explanation. Only the faintest traces, like a breeze passing over the surface of water, leaving no shape behind, yet subtly altering what lies there. When people hear of this, many immediately think of unusual experiences, intuitions that arise without reason, a feeling of familiarity with a place never visited, or a brief moment when reality seems slightly out of phase. Science does not rush to name these things. It does not hurry to affirm them nor to deny them. It simply acknowledges that there are phenomena not yet fully explained. And at night, when there is no longer a need to control everything, that incompleteness becomes far easier to live with. Carl Jung, from the perspective of depth psychology, spoke of meaningful coincidences, synchronicity. In synchronicity, and a causal connecting principle, he wrote, "Synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see." Jung did not claim that another world was sending us signals. He merely suggested that there are connections that do not require clear causation. Connections that are not strong, not loud, but sufficient to make us pause. Like parallel worlds touching one another, not to change each other, but to remind us that they coexist. Seen this way, faint traces are no longer frightening. They become a kind of whisper from the universe, not to demand attention, but to keep reality from becoming too sealed, too rigid. Martin Heidegger once wrote in Being and Time, "The mystery is not that the world is, but that it is. Existence itself is already strange. The fact that it leaves behind traces we cannot fully explain does not make it less stable. It only makes existence deeper." When worlds touch each other very gently, they do not collapse the familiar structure of your life. They do not ask you to believe. They merely allow a small opening in how we think about reality. And sometimes it is precisely through such openings that the mind can breathe. In everyday life, we are often exhausted by the feeling that everything must be clear, must have a cause, must have an explanation, must arrive at a conclusion. But the human body and mind were not made to live forever in that state. They need blurred edges, indeterminate spaces. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote in The Gay Science, "One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star." Chaos here is not destructive disorder. It is openness, the capacity for what is unclear to coexist without strain. Weak interactions between worlds, if they exist, do not make your reality less safe. They simply suggest that you are not living within a perfectly closed system, and that when felt in the right way can bring a deep relief. You do not need to understand every strange thing that happens in your life. You do not need to assign them grand meanings. You do not need to trace the origin of every sensation. You only need to know this reality is wide enough to hold both what is clear and what remains faint. As the night continues to drift on, those very subtle traces do not need to be held in awareness. They can dissolve like mist on the surface of a lake, and in that dissolving, the mind no longer has to tense itself to understand. It is allowed to let go. Sleep, like those weak interactions, arrives very gently, without announcement, without explanation, just enough for you to feel that you are being held by a reality wider than anything you need to know. When the faint traces of the previous chapter have had time to dissolve, when the thought that worlds might touch ever so gently no longer tightens the mind, the current of reflection opens into a wider space. We are no longer at the microscopic level of particles and fluctuations, but drifting instead into cosmology, where the story is no longer about subtle contacts, but about the entire picture unfolding. In some modern models, our universe is not all that exists. It may be only a bubble, not fragile in the sense of easily bursting, but a self-contained region of space and time born within a much larger sea of inflation. That sea does not stand still. It continues to expand, continues to give rise to other bubbles, each bubble a universe with its own laws, constants, and history. Some bubbles expand long enough to form stars, planets, and rare moments of consciousness. Others fade quickly, never quite becoming a story. When told in the language of cosmology, this idea can sound overwhelming. But at night, when you are no longer trying to picture everything, it carries a very deep comfort that existence is not a single event, not one absolutely privileged moment. It is an ongoing process, quietly coming into being, drifting and dissolving like the breath of the universe itself. Alan Guth, who laid the foundations of inflationary theory, once said, "The universe may be eternal in the future, but it had a beginning in the past." His words are not meant to shrink the vastness, but to suggest that beginnings and continuations can coexist. A bubble may have a point of birth, while the surrounding sea of inflation never needs to stop. When people hear about bubble universes, many immediately feel small. But perhaps that smallness is not a diminishment. It is a release. For if our universe is only one bubble among countless others, then the tensions you are carrying do not have to bear the weight of representing all of existence. They are simply small oscillations within a very particular region of space and time. Blaise Pascal once wrote in Pensées, "The eternal silence of these infinite spaces frightens me." But perhaps that fear arises only when we imagine ourselves thrown into infinity with no shelter. If instead we picture ourselves inside a bubble supported by its own structure, then infinity no longer feels like a terrifying void, but like a quiet background that allows everything to occur. In the image of a bubble universe, there is no absolute center. No bubble is more important than another simply because it lasts longer or gives rise to more structure. Each bubble is a complete world for whatever exists within it. Hannah Arendt once wrote, "The world lies between people, and this in-betweenness is today the object of the greatest concern and the most obvious upheaval in almost all countries of the globe." Though she was writing about politics and human life, her words can be heard more broadly. Meaning does not lie in the entire sea of inflation. but in the between, the space where life and consciousness can appear. If our universe is a bubble, then that between is precisely where you are. You do not need to be the center of everything, only the center of this experience. At night, the image of bubbles drifting in an inflationary sea does not need to be visualized clearly. You do not need to map infinity. You only need to feel its rhythm coming into being, expanding, and allowing everything to unfold very slowly. Heraclitus once said, "Everything flows." Perhaps eternal inflation is simply the modern way for science to restate a very old truth. Nothing stands still forever, not even the universe. But what flows is not therefore meaningless. A bubble that exists long enough to contain a night, a breath, a moment of listening, this alone is a very quiet miracle. When you place yourself within that picture, the anxiety about having to possess some greater meaning begins to soften. You do not need to prove anything to an infinite sea of inflation. You only need to be present in this bubble in this moment. Carl Sagan once wrote in Cosmos, "For small creatures such as we, the vastness is bearable only through love." Perhaps what makes immensity bearable is not understanding its entire structure, but the ability to feel a very small warmth exactly where we stand. As bubbles are born and fade, no bubble knows how long it will last. And it is precisely this not knowing that allows each one to expand fully. Tonight, you also do not need to know where your life will go. You do not need to know where ultimate meaning lies. You only need to be here in this very personal bubble of experience, letting the slow narration pass through you like a gentle current of inflation. And as awareness gradually recedes, as the image of bubbles softens and fades, sleep can arrive not as a disappearance, but as a natural continuation of the flow that has been carrying you from the beginning. In the infinite sea of inflation, this bubble, this moment, is calm enough to allow you to rest. When the image of cosmic bubbles from the previous chapter has had time to dissolve into the fabric of night, when the thought that existence can arise, drift, and fade without an absolute center has become familiar, the current of reflection opens in another direction. Not wider in terms of distance, but deeper in terms of dimension. Perhaps what makes reality feel closed is not that it is too small, but that our senses can touch only a very thin layer of it. In some modern physical models, especially those surrounding the idea of brain universes, our universe is not the entirety of space that exists. It may be only a brain, a three-dimensional surface drifting within a higher dimensional space that our eyes, ears, and even our intuition were never designed to perceive. If this is so, other universes do not need to be far away. They could lie right beside ours, separated only by dimensions we cannot reach. Heard at night, this thought does not overwhelm. It evokes something quieter, the sense that reality may be thicker than the life we usually inhabit. We are accustomed to 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time. Together they form the frame within which all our experiences unfold. But that frame does not have to be the entire structure. Immanuel Kant once wrote in Critique of Pure Reason's Space is not something objective and real, nor a substance, nor an accident, nor a relation. Instead, it is a subjective condition of sensibility. If space itself is a condition of perception, then the existence of other dimensions does not shatter reality. It merely reminds us that what we can sense is not all that is there. In the image of brain universes, each universe is its own surface, preserving its own structure and laws. They do not overlap in ways that create conflict. They coexist within a larger space, like pages resting side by side in a book of which we are reading only one page. No page intrudes upon another. Yet their closeness is not meaningless. Placed beside human experience, this idea carries a very quiet kind of healing. For perhaps your life too has more dimensions than the ones you live in during the day. Thoughts left unspoken, emotions without names, possibilities never touched. They do not need to conflict for you to be allowed to be yourself. They can exist side by side within inner dimensions that ordinary awareness does not reach. Carl Jung once wrote in The Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche, "The psyche consists of many layers." Jung did not use the language of physics, yet he touched the same intuition reality. Both outer and inner is not flat. It has depth. When you feel divided within yourself, it may not be because something is wrong, but because multiple dimensions of you are coexisting. And like brain universes, they do not need to merge for you to be at peace. At night, when the senses loosen their grip and the light softens, human consciousness naturally comes closer to those depths. There is no need to understand, no need to analyze, only to feel. Martin Heidegger once wrote in Poetry Language Thought, "The world whirls." That brief line does not define the world as a static object. It suggests that the world is constantly unfolding itself, opening new dimensions for presence. If space has more dimensions than we can perceive, then human loneliness can also be heard differently, not as abandonment in a cold void, but as existing within a larger structure we have not yet fully touched. Perhaps those moments when you feel you do not entirely belong to this world are not signs of alienation, but a subtle intuition of the depth of being. Rainer Maria Rilke once wrote in Letters to a Young Poet, "Try to love the questions themselves." To love the questions not in order to answer them, but to live with them like living within a space that has more dimensions than you once imagined. When universes can lie side by side in invisible dimensions, reality no longer feels like a wall. It becomes a thin membrane, firm enough to support you, gentle enough not to imprison you. And you, in this moment of listening, do not need to step into another dimension. You do not need to open any door. You only need to know this reality is not sealed around you. It has depth. It has room to breathe. As the night deepens, those unseen dimensions do not need to be pictured clearly. They can dissolve into a simple feeling that you are being held by a structure larger than the very specific worries of daily life. Blaise Pascal once wrote in Pensées, "Man is but a reed the weakest in nature, but he is a thinking reed." Perhaps what keeps a human being from breaking is not strength, but the ability to sense that one exists within a world deeper than fear. And when you stop trying to force reality into simplicity, stop forcing yourself into perfect consistency, the mind begins to loosen. Sleep, like another dimension of consciousness, requires no explanation. It needs only a space wide enough for you to let yourself fall into it. Tonight, let the idea of unseen dimensions remain as a background feeling that you are not trapped on a flat surface of existence. You are being supported by depths you do not need to reach in order to be allowed to rest. When the idea of unseen dimensions from the previous chapter has had time to settle, when the sense that reality is deeper than what the senses can touch has become familiar, an ancient force quietly enters the story. Not loudly, not brightly, not demanding attention. It is gravity. Gravity is the first force human beings ever feel, and yet it remains the least fully understood. It keeps you resting on this bed, keeps Earth circling the sun, keeps galaxies from dissolving into the deep darkness. And the strange thing is this: among all the fundamental forces of nature, gravity is extraordinarily weak. So weak that a small magnet in your hand can overcome the gravitational pull of the entire planet when it lifts a paperclip from the ground. That weakness is not a minor flaw. It is a profound question. Why should a force that governs the structure of the entire universe be so fragile? Some scientists have quietly suggested a hypothesis. Perhaps gravity does not belong solely to this universe. Perhaps gravity is the one thing that can leave our space-time brain drifting into other dimensions, other universes, making it appear weak in the world we experience. If this were true, gravity would not be merely a pull, it would be a whisper, a trace of connection reaching beyond familiar boundaries. Isaac Newton once wrote in Principia, gravity explains the motions of the planets, but it cannot explain who sets the planets in motion. Newton saw the order, yet sensed something unfinished. Gravity explains how things move, but not fully why such a structure exists at all. Centuries later, Albert Einstein softened gravity by seeing it not as an invisible pull, but as the curvature of space-time. And yet, even in relativity, gravity stands alone, never fully merging with the other forces, as if it comes from a deeper layer, a wider structure. Einstein once wrote, "The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible." Perhaps gravity reminds us that this comprehensibility still contains very subtle openings. At night, the idea that gravity might leak into other worlds does not need to be understood technically. It can be felt as a gentle metaphor, that there are things in your life that always affect you, keep you grounded, shape your movement, yet never announce themselves. Weak connections, faint memories, background emotions without names always present. Carl Jung once wrote in The Undiscovered Self, "Man is not a machine that can be remodeled for quite other purposes as occasion demands. Human beings are not held together only by strong, obvious forces. We are sustained by things that are very weak, yet enduring. Gravity does not need your attention to continue its work. It does not need to be seen. It does not need daily proof. And perhaps the most important elements of inner life are the same. They do not arrive as dramatic events. They come as a very gentle pull, turning you back toward yourself, toward where you belong, even when you are not aware of it." Martin Heidegger once wrote in Being and Time, "Not every entity is accessible in the same way. Not everything needs the same kind of attention. Some things can only be sensed when we stop trying to grasp them. If gravity truly moves through dimensions, then its weakness is not a deficiency. It is the cost of connection. It must be weak so as not to fracture the structure of each world. It must be light to be present in many places at once. And for that reason, it does not command. It only invites." Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "One must have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star. But for that star not to scatter, there must also be a very quiet force that keeps it in orbit." In modern life, we are often pulled by very strong forces: pressure, expectation, speed, comparison. They are loud, they are clear, they exhaust us. But tonight, as everything slows, you may feel other forces holding you: the bed beneath your back, the steady rhythm of breath, the gentle, pleasant heaviness of the body being held against the earth. Gravity in this moment is not a scientific concept. It is an intimate experience, and if it truly whispers between worlds, then tonight it is whispering to you that you do not need to drift. You are being held not by force, but by something gentle enough not to hurt, steady enough not to let go. As Simone Weil once wrote, gravity and grace are the two forces that govern the universe. Perhaps gravity is grace in its roughest form, a support without conditions, a presence without explanation. As awareness slowly recedes, as you stop trying to understand dimensions or parallel universes, gravity remains, quiet, patient. And it is precisely in that patience that sleep can arrive, not as something pulling you down, but as something holding you up. As if somewhere between worlds there is a very gentle force telling you you are allowed to rest. When the whisper of gravity from the previous chapter has had time to fade, when the feeling that a very gentle force is quietly holding you within this world has become familiar, we arrive at something even more discreet. Not a force with a clear name, not a structure with a shape, but a shadow. In cosmology, it is called dark matter. It does not emit light. It does not reflect. It does not interact with light in any way that eyes or telescopes can see. It does not touch you. It does not speak to you. It leaves no direct trace. And yet it pulls. Galaxies rotate faster than they should. Star clusters do not fly apart as calculations predict. Orbits are held together by something that is not visibly present. Dark matter does not appear. It only leaves its influence behind. Heard at night, this idea carries a deep resonance that there are things in the universe and within you that do not need to reveal themselves in order to shape every movement. Dark matter is like a shadow cast across the structure of reality. You do not see a shadow because there is light. You notice it only when the light bends. And in the same way, we often recognize the invisible only when our lives tilt slightly out of alignment. Albert Einstein once wrote, "Reality is merely an illusion, albeit a very persistent one." This does not deny the world. It only reminds us that what endures most stubbornly is not always what appears most clearly. In physics, some hypotheses quietly suggest that dark matter may not belong to this universe in the usual way. It may be a gravitational trace from another reality existing alongside ours. If so, dark matter is not a flaw in the model. It is a footprint, the footprint of another world that is present but does not touch our light. This idea does not need to be true in order to be meaningful. For in human life there is much dark matter of this kind. Memories you no longer recall clearly yet, which still shape your reactions. Relationships that have ended yet still influence how you trust. Emotions you cannot name yet, which pull you in certain directions. Carl Jung once wrote in Ion, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Jung did not call these invisible things enemies. He simply called them unseen parts. The dark matter of the mind does not need to be fully illuminated for you to live a whole life. It only needs to be acknowledged as a background force. In the universe without dark matter, galaxies would not coalesce. Large-scale structures would not form. Life as we know it might have nowhere to settle. That shadow paradoxically has given light a place to stand. And so it is with human beings. The parts you do not display, the silences you keep for yourself, the wordless sorrows, they do not break you. They hold you together. Martin Heidegger once wrote in Being and Time, "The nothing itself nothings." Non-being is not emptiness. It is another mode of presence. If dark matter is the shadow of another world, then perhaps its presence is not meant to unsettle us. It only reminds us that reality does not close itself around light. There are things that exist solely to keep everything from falling apart. In modern life, we are often obsessed with needing clarity, transparency, explanation. But the universe, in its long silence, tells a different story, that some things only need to pull. They do not need to speak. They do not need to reveal themselves. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "One must have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star. But for that star not to shatter, there must also be a darkness deep enough for it to orbit within. As you lie here in a room where the lights are off, you do not need to see everything to feel safe. Darkness is not your enemy. It is the ground that allows the body to rest. Dark matter does not threaten the universe. It supports it in the quietest way possible. And perhaps what supports you in your most exhausted moments is also not what you consciously recognize." As Rainer Maria Rilke once wrote in Letters to a Young Poet, "Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. No feeling is final. No shadow is permanent. But while they are here, they serve their purpose." After previous chapters opened parallel worlds, unseen dimensions, and whispering forces, dark matter appears as a final low note before sleep draws nearer. It does not ask you to believe. It does not demand understanding. It simply invites you to loosen your grip on the light, to allow part of reality to remain in shadow, to allow yourself not to be fully illuminated. And when you do, when consciousness stops trying to shine on everything, the body begins to soften. The breath deepens. The weight of the long day is set down. Dark matter remains silent, nameless, without form, holding galaxies together. And perhaps holding you together as well in this moment. Sleep arrives not as a disappearance, but as a gentle shadow wide enough for you to rest within. When the shadow of dark matter from the previous chapter has had time to dissolve into the fabric of night, when the idea that unseen things quietly keep all structures from falling apart has become familiar, the current of thought drifts toward an even deeper question. No longer about what holds the universe together, but about how it began at all. For decades, we have been told a very tidy story. The universe began with a big bang. A single point, hot, dense, infinite. Time began. Space opened. Everything emerged from almost nothing. It is a powerful story, clear, decisive, and deeply human. We are used to believing that everything must have a definite beginning, a moment zero, a sharp boundary between what was not and what is. But when science looks closely enough, it begins to speak more slowly. Some physicists have quietly proposed another possibility. The Big Bang may not be the beginning of everything. It may have been a collision between universes, between structures that already existed. Not creation from nothingness, but the continuation of a deeper flow. This idea does not deny the Big Bang. It simply places it within a longer story, less dramatic perhaps, but far gentler. If the Big Bang was a collision, then our universe is not an orphan born of nothing but the result of a contact between realities already present. At night, this thought does not make the beginning feel colder. it makes it less lonely. Stephen Hawking once wrote in A Brief History of Time, "The question of what happened before the Big Bang is meaningless." His words were not meant to shut down imagination, but to reflect the limits of language and models. Yet other scientists have approached the question differently, not asking what came before the Big Bang, but asking what context the Big Bang belonged to. And when the question changes, the story changes as well. In some brain cosmology models, the Big Bang may be the trace of a collision between two space-time brains, like two bodies of water touching, sending ripples outward. Our universe may be one such ripple. No explosion required, no absolute moment. Only a contact strong enough to open a new history. Heard in the slow cadence of night, this no longer feels like abstract physics. It becomes something deeply human, that the greatest beginnings do not always arise from nothingness, but from encounters, from meetings, from collisions whose full scope we cannot see. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "All things are entwined, enamored, ensnared." Perhaps not only human fate, but the fate of the universe itself is woven from relationships rather than absolute starting points. If the Big Bang was not the only beginning, then the idea of an ending also softens. It is no longer a closed line, but a cycle, a continuation. In many ancient philosophical traditions, the notion of creation from nothing was always questioned. Parmenides once said, "Nothing comes from nothing." That ancient line resonates strangely within modern cosmology. If nothing truly comes from nothing, then every beginning is a transformation, one form dissolving so that another may appear. And when this is felt at night, it brings a deep comfort. Perhaps the great upheavals in your own life were not meaningless explosions either. They were collisions between who you were and who you are becoming. Carl Jung once wrote in Symbols of Transformation, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. Awareness is not born from emptiness. It emerges from tension, from strong points of contact, from the collision of inner forces." The Big Bang of the universe and the Big Bang of the inner life differ in scale, but share a nature. Neither comes from nothing. Both arise from a ground already there. When the Big Bang is seen as a collision, the universe no longer feels like a solitary story. It becomes a chapter in a very thick book where each page opens from the one before. And you, in this moment of listening, are not a random appearance either. You are the result of countless contacts, light, gravity, darkness, weak forces, worlds brushing close. As Simone Weil once wrote, "Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity." Tonight, you do not need to understand what the Big Bang truly was. You do not need to decide whether it was the only beginning. It is enough to sense this existence does not close itself at a point. It opens, continues, and allows new stories to form from deep collisions. As your awareness begins to soften, as cosmic images fade into a background, feeling the idea of the Big Bang no longer needs to be held. It can become something very light, the sense that you were not thrown into life from nothingness. You came from a current, and you are still being carried by it. Sleep in this way is not a small ending. It is a transition, a gentle continuation of the flow that has been holding the universe long before the moment we call the beginning. When the story of the universe's beginning has lowered its voice, when the Big Bang is no longer heard as a single explosion, but as a continuation within a deeper current, philosophy begins to enter as well, not through argument, but through a very quiet question. If every possibility happens somewhere, if each choice opens another branch of existence, then where does the meaning of choice reside? This question is not new. It has accompanied humanity for a very long time, ever since we realized that every decision carries a sense of loss. To choose one path is not to walk the others. And it is this exclusion that has made choice feel heavy. But when the idea of many worlds appears, when science whispers that perhaps no path is ever truly abandoned, another unease arises. If every path is taken somewhere, does what I choose still matter? Philosophy does not rush to answer. It softens its voice. It invites you to sit with the question as one might sit beside a small fire at night, not to be warmed by solutions, but by presence. Human beings do not live in all possibilities. We live in an experience, a very narrow timeline, a sequence of moments that can only be felt from the inside. And it is precisely this narrowness that gives birth to meaning. William James once wrote in The Varieties of Religious Experience, "Our normal waking consciousness is but one special type of consciousness. If our awareness is only one mode among many, then choice is not about deciding where the entire universe goes. It is about deciding which experience will be lived from within. When you choose something, you are not only choosing an outcome, you are choosing the feeling of walking that path, the very particular mornings, the real relationships, the wounds and healings that can occur only in this branch. Other branches, if they exist, are living their own lives, but they cannot replace the experience unfolding within you right now, because meaning does not reside in the number of possibilities, but in the depth of presence. Soren Kierkegaard once suggested that what drives a person to despair is not a lack of possibilities, but a failure to become oneself. Whatever layers his words contain, their spirit, his clear meaning does not lie in living everything, but in living one thing fully. At night, when you think about choices already made, you may still hear the whisper of what if. What if I had chosen differently? What if I had turned another way? What if I had been someone else? The idea that those paths may be lived somewhere does not need to diminish your present. On the contrary, it can help loosen regret, not because those paths do not matter, but because you do not need to carry them in order to prove your worth. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote of amor fati, the love of one's fate, not loving it because it is the only path, but loving it because it is the path you are living from within. When philosophy lowers its voice, it no longer asks, which choice is the correct one? It asks, are you staying with the choice you have made? For if every possibility exists, then the rarest thing is not possibility, but attention. Rainer Maria Rilke once wrote in Letters to a Young Poet, "Live the questions now, not to live in order to answer, but to live in order to experience the questions present in your life." Meaning is not an object waiting at the end of the road. It is a feeling woven from the way you walk. In a universe where every choice may occur somewhere, you do not need to strain yourself to choose correctly. You only need to choose to remain with the decision that brought you here, to remain with this breath, to remain with the body lying at rest. Philosophy at this point is no longer a system of thought. It becomes a very slow lullaby, reminding you that you do not need to optimize your life before being allowed to rest. If every path is taken somewhere, then this path, this small private path, is already enough for you to be you. and because of that choice, does not lose its meaning. It is freed from the burden of representing everything. At night, as awareness begins to blur, the question of meaning does not need to be held. It can dissolve into the feeling that you are living an experience that cannot be replaced. Sleep in this light is not an abandonment of choice. It is a trust that meaning does not vanish when you stop thinking about it. It remains in the heartbeat, in the breath, in the simple fact that you chose to stay with this night. And that is enough. When the question of the meaning of choice has softened, when philosophy no longer presses you to define who you are among countless possibilities, another feeling begins to appear very slowly. Not confusion, but a quiet unease. If there are many versions of me, am I still one? This is the moment when philosophy does not need to speak loudly. It sits beside you, allowing the breath to become steadier, allowing awareness to stop tensing itself in defense of the ego. Because what the idea of many worlds suggests is not the fragmentation of the self, but the gentle limitation of experience. No matter how many versions of you may exist in imagination, in memory, in unrealized possibilities, the version lying here and listening right now is the only one that feels the bed beneath the back, the only one whose breath is slowing, the only one who can rest. And that is enough. Modern life exhausts us not because we lack identity, but because we carry too many identities at once, overlapping roles, conflicting expectations, images of who we should have been. But identity does not function like a collection that must be completed. It functions like a point of view. William James once wrote in The Principles of Psychology, "The self is not an entity, but a process." If identity is a process, then it is not broken by the existence of many possibilities. It simply flows along one stream of experience. And tonight, that stream is this moment. There is a familiar fear that if other versions of you are living different lives somewhere, then the life you are living now becomes less complete, as if you were left behind. But the opposite is true. Wholeness does not come from living everything, but from not having to live everything. If you had to carry every possibility, identity would dissolve into endless noise. Carl Jung once wrote in The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious. The ego is only the center of consciousness, not of the whole personality. Identity runs deeper than awareness. It is not threatened by what you do not experience. It needs only one anchor. And that anchor is not found in other versions of you, but in your very concrete presence right now. In many works of science fiction, people fear encountering another version of themselves, fear being replaced, erased, no longer the original. But philosophy, when it lowers its voice, whispers something else. There is no original that needs to be defended. There is only the experience that is happening. Soren Kierkegaard once wrote in The Sickness Unto Death, "To be oneself is the greatest venture." Not because the self is fragile, but because staying with oneself requires a deep acceptance. Accepting that you do not need to be all versions to be whole. Accepting that you do not need to represent every possibility to be worthy of love. As you lie here, you do not need to carry your other selves. You do not need to check whether they are happier. You do not need to compare this branch with another. Such comparisons are the mind's way of trying to maintain control in a universe that is too wide. But night does not require control. Night requires permission. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "One must learn to love oneself, not as an abstract idea, but as a very small act, staying with the version that is breathing, that is tired, that needs rest." If there are many versions of you, they do not compete. They do not ask you to choose between them. They simply exist like different melodies you do not need to hear at the same time. Music needs silence in order not to become noise. Identity is the same. Martin Heidegger once wrote in Being and Time, Dasein is an entity, which in each case I myself am. In each case I am myself. Not all possibilities, not every version, just me here. And for that reason, identity is not broken when the universe expands. It is protected by the limits of experience. When you stop trying to become a perfect synthesis, the body begins to loosen. Muscles no longer need to hold an image. Thoughts no longer need to stand guard. Rainer Maria Rilke once wrote in Letters to a Young Poet, "Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart. Patience with what remains unresolved is not surrender. It is how you allow identity to rest. At night, identity does not need to be defined. It only needs to be felt. You are the one who is listening, the one who is breathing, the one who is setting the long day down. No other version is required to complete you. Nothing is missing for you to be enough. And when awareness begins to drift, when the boundaries of I soften, that is not disintegration, it is safety. Sleep does not erase identity. It temporarily frees you from the task of holding it together. You do not need to be anyone else tonight. You do not need to become. You do not need to prove. The version lying here and listening quiet real is the only one you need to care for. And that is enough to let sleep arrive. When identity has been set down safely, when you no longer need to defend yourself against countless versions that might exist, a deeper, slower question begins to unfold. Not a question of who, but a question of when. Time. We usually think of time as an arrow. It begins in the past, rushes through the present, and disappears into the future. It does not turn back. It does not wait. It shows no mercy. But at night, when all movement slows, when the body stops counting hours, time begins to appear as something else. Not sharp, not straight, but soft. Perhaps time is not an objective flow at all, but a sensation. St. Augustine once wrote in Confessions, "What then is time? If no one asks me, I know what it is. If I wish to explain it to him who asks, I do not know." We feel time before we define it. We feel it speed up in joy, stretch out in pain, vanish in sleep. And that feeling is something no clock can measure. In modern physics, time too begins to lose its certainty. Einstein showed that there is no single shared now for the universe. Every motion, every position carries its own rhythm of time. He once wrote in a letter to the family of a departed friend, "The distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion." If even in science the past, present, and future are not absolute compartments, then perhaps the mind has always known this. It is just that during the day, we need time as an arrow to work to arrive, to not get lost in responsibility. But night does not need an arrow. Night needs space. In multiverse ideas, a moment may not disappear when it passes. It simply stops being experienced by present awareness. The past is not erased. The future is not non-existent. They simply lie outside the point of view where you are standing. Julian Barber, a theoretical physicist, has suggested that time may not exist as we think that only moments exist side by side. no flow, only arrangement. Philosophy, hearing this, does not panic. It breathes more slowly. If nothing truly disappears, then who you once were is not lost. What you once felt is not denied. It is simply not here in this moment. Martin Heidegger once wrote in Being and Time is not a thing, and thus nothing which is, and yet it remains constant in its passing away without being something temporal like a being in time. Time is not an object that can be held or lost. It is the way consciousness arranges existence so that it can live with it. When you worry about the past, it is not because the past is returning. It is because awareness is touching another point in the structure of experience. When you fear the future, it is not because the future is arriving. It is because the mind is reaching toward a region that is not needed right now. And when you are tired, what you need is not more time, but to let go of the arrow. In a multiverse, no moment needs to be clutched so it will not vanish. No decision needs to be rescued from passing away. Each moment already has its place within the whole. Borges once wrote in A New Refutation of Time, "Time is the substance I am made of." If time is the substance you are made of, then you cannot be left behind by it. You cannot arrive late to yourself. You can only be present or not present in a particular feeling. And tonight, you are allowed not to be present in urgency. When you close your eyes, time begins to lose its borders. A memory may drift by as lightly as breath. An image of the future may dissolve before it fully forms. Not because you are escaping time, but because awareness is returning to a more primordial state, one where it does not need to arrange everything into, before, and after. In sleep, time does not go anywhere. It simply stops being counted. And that is when the body begins to heal, not through effort, but through permission. If nothing truly disappears, then you do not need to grip today in fear of forgetting it. You do not need to hold this moment tightly for it to matter. Meaning does not lie in stretching time, but in being present when it is felt. At night, meaning does not need to be explained. It only needs to be sensed as a very thin reassurance. You are not moving toward the future. You are not leaving the past behind. You are simply drifting between layers of experience like a slow wave. And when sleep arrives, it is not a break in time. It is another way of existing within it. No arrow, no pressure, no disappearance. Only a very quiet feeling that you do not need to hurry because there is nowhere you have never belonged. And in that feeling, time can rest with you. After time has softened, after the past no longer pulls you backward, and the future no longer urges you to move faster, we arrive at a very quiet point. Not a conclusion, but a permission. Permission for you to be lighter. Throughout this journey, you have heard vast ideas, the multiverse, branching existences, parallel worlds, time no longer an arrow identity, no longer a fixed block. But none of these were told to make you feel small. They were told so that you would not have to be the center of everything. For one of the quietest burdens of modern life is the feeling that you must understand, must carry, must be responsible for all of reality, as if you do not understand the world, it will collapse. As if you are not alert enough, strong enough, deep enough, existence itself would lose its meaning. Philosophy, when it lowers its voice to a whisper, says something very different. You do not need to carry the weight of the whole of reality. Marcus Aurelius once wrote in Meditations, "You could leave life right now. let that determine what you do and say and think. This line is not meant to instill fear. It gestures toward the gentle fragility of presence, that the fact you are here breathing, listening, is already something that needs no further justification. Whether the universe is one or many, whether there are countless branches of existence, countless versions of reality quietly unfolding, you do not need to represent them. You do not need to understand everything in order to be allowed to rest. People are often exhausted not because the world is too vast, but because they try to become the whole world inside their own minds. You were not born to be everything. You were born to experience something very specific. Albert Camus once wrote in The Myth of Sisyphus, "The struggle itself is enough to fill a man's heart." Not because struggle is glorious, but because living within all its uncertainty is already sufficient. If a multiverse exists, it does not ask you to become more important. It simply highlights something very simple: this presence is rare. Not rare because you are unique among all possibilities, but rare because you are experiencing this right now. No one else is having this exact feeling in your place. You do not need to be all versions of yourself for life to have meaning. You do not need to hold every possibility for existence to be complete. Meaning does not come from encompassing everything, but from staying gently within the small portion you are living. Ludwig Wittgenstein once wrote in Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, "The sense of the world must lie outside the world." Perhaps meaning is not found in explaining the world, but in the way you are with it. And tonight, being with the world may be as simple as not trying, no effort to understand more, no need to reorganize, no need to grasp. Just breathing, just listening, letting the body rest within a universe that does not ask you to carry it. You do not need to become deeper right now. You do not need another insight. You do not need to take any question into sleep. Philosophy, when it truly heals, does not leave questions behind. It leaves reassurance. Rainer Maria Rilke once wrote in Letters to a Young Poet, "Live the questions now." But there are nights when you do not need to live with questions. You only need to live. If the multiverse exists, it does not make you meaningless. It only reminds you of something gentle: you are not everything, and that is a relief. A relief because you are not responsible for all that has happened. A relief because you do not need to predict all that will come. A relief because you are allowed to be a small being within a vast structure and still be enough. Heidegger once wrote in Being and Time, "Care is the being of Dasein." But care is not always action. Sometimes care is letting go of the need to understand, the need to control, the need to become. In this moment, you do not need to do anything more to deserve rest. The fact that you are aware, breathing, listening is already something rare, not because the universe is scarce, but because attention is. And tonight, you have allowed yourself to attend to this very presence. If sleep comes, let it come not as a shutting down, but as a soft continuation of being. You do not need to carry reality with you. You do not need to hold the universe. You do not need to be everything. You only need to be here in a moment, small enough to feel safe, wide enough to allow rest. And as awareness slowly drifts, as thoughts dissolve like night mist, remember one final thing very gently: you are not abandoned in a vast universe. You are being held by the simple fact of not being everything. Sleep now. Reality will remain. The universe will continue. You do not need to keep watch. You are allowed to rest.